Hello viewers, welcome to Study with Master Notes again. How are you all? Hope you all are fine. Okay. Thank you viewers for liking, sharing and subscribing my channel. Please share with your friends and like, share and subscribe more to this channel, and you will get more notification about my upcoming videos of English literature and in teaching of English. Okay, so we will study today the block 7 unit 3 of amazing novel, your British novel, first year British novel amazing 3, that is unit 3 of block 7, a portrait of the artist as a young man. Okay, already I have covered unit 1 and 2. You can go to my previous videos and you will get all the description about it. And we will study unit 3, Stephen's growth and personality of the portrait, a portrait of the artist as a young man. Okay, unit 3, that is Stephen's growth and personality. So we will study this. Here it is the structure, objectives, introduction, a section by section mapping, Stephen's aesthetic theory, Stephen and women, let us sum of questions and suggested reading. Here it is the objective. As a portrait is among other things a novel of formation and an artist novel, this unit looks at the stages of Stephen's growth from infancy to manhood. Okay, the novel of formation and an artist novel. As a portrait is among other things. Here it is the main key point, you can note down. Here it is the objectives of the novel. So every unit has its own objective. If we understand the objectives clearly, then it will be easy for to capture all these things of this unit. Okay, so here it is a novel of formation as a portrait is among other things and an artist novel. This unit looks at the stages of Stephen's growth. Okay, Stephen's growth from infancy to manhood through a section by section mapping covering all the 19 sections that constitute the 5 chapters. Stephen's aesthetic theory is examined and his relationship with women is looked at too. The thing to note is that Stephen's aesthetic theory is not quite Joyce's aesthetic theory. Okay, so Stephen's aesthetic theory is not quite Joyce's aesthetic theory, and that is attitude to women cannot and should not be equated with Joyce's attitude to women. Okay, it is quite different. That is Stephen's attitudes to women and Joyce's attitude to women. Then here is the introduction. A portrait concerns itself both the growing up and with the early life of an artist. The novel traces the two together, but you must remember that it also deals implicitly with the relationship between these two. There are certain tensions occasioned by the different demands that growing up and Stephen stands as an artist make on him. There are certain tensions occasioned by the different demands that growing up and Stephen stands as an artist make on him. The novel deals with these tensions and constantly takes into account the conflicts between Stephen's drive towards adulthood and his drive towards becoming an artist. Okay, the novel deals with these tensions and constantly takes into account the conflicts between Stephen's drive towards adulthood and his drive towards becoming an artist. Stephen's attempt to resolve the struggle between these two kinds of drives also deserves attention. Okay, the novel deals with these tensions and constantly takes into account the conflicts between Stephen's drive towards adulthood and his drive towards becoming an artist. Stephen's attempt to resolve the struggle between these two kinds of drives also deserves attention. Okay, so the novel deals with these tensions and constantly takes into account the conflicts between Stephen's drive towards the adulthood and his drive towards becoming an artist. Stephen's attempt to resolve the struggle between these two kinds of drives also deserve attention. Okay, so what is the main attention? That is Stephen's attempt to resolve the struggle between these two kinds of drives. Okay, so here we will study a section by section mapping. The 5 chapters of the novel are divided into 19 sections in all. Okay, here the question arises, how many chapters in the portrait of the artist as a young man? The 5 chapters. Okay, there are 5 chapters and the novel are divided into 19 sections. Let us take a quick look at what happens in each of them. The first section of the chapter, one shows Stefan at home in his infancy. There is a bedtime story and song. Stefan is baby Tuko. There is a reference to bed wetting and the warm and cold feelings that go with it. His father's hairy face and his mother's smell nicer than his father's are catalogued. Uncle Charles and Dante are introduced. Dante's two brushes follow a pattern based on colors. One has a black velvet back, that is for David. The other one with a green velvet back is for Parnell, the Irish Home Rule leader who was betrayed by the church. The Vances are introduced. They are Ellen's father and mother. There is a repetition of the imperative apologize. Okay, there is a repetition of the imperative apologize. Here it is a main key point you can note down. In the first chapter of the a portrait of the artist as a young man, the Ellen's fathers and mother, there is a repetition of the imperative apologize. That's section 2. Shows life at Clongos school. Okay, a football game is on. Stefan keeps on the fringe of his line, out of the sight of his perfect, out of the reach of their rude feet. He felt his body small and weak. He is caught in a whirl of a scrimmage and is fearful of the flashing eyes and muddy boots. One of the Stefan's thought is that it was mean of Wells to shoulder him into the square ditch because he would not soup his little snuff box for Wells seasoned backing chestnut. The coldness of the water of the ditch stays with Stefan. A whole series of the associations is triggered by the word sock. Wells bullying him about whether Stefan kissed his mother before he went to bed brings back memories of the ditch. Then there is a geography lesson. The atmosphere in the chapel where night prayers were held is evoked. Once again Stefan thinks of smells. These include the smell of old peasants who knelt at the back of the chapel at Sunday Mass. There is a memory of a train ride. Homewards and the welcome received at home. But actually Stefan is sick. On the way to the infirmary, he remembers with a vague fear the warm, tough-colored bog water, the warm, moist air, the noise of plunge, the smell on the towels like medicines. He visualizes his own dying. The section closes the news of the parental deaths, an event that serves as a significant recurrent motif in the novel. The third scene of the chapter 1 is Christmas dinner at home. Mr. Casey is a guest. Talk of Vernal leads to violent quarrel. In this course of the quarrel, Dante says quite hotly, "Oh, he will remember all this when he grows up." The language he heard against God and religion and priest in his own home. Then page 33. Mr. Casey's retort, equally hot, is, "Let him remember him too." The language with which the priest and the priest pawns broke Parnell's heart and hounded him into his grave. Page 33. Stephen's father now says, "Son of bitches." When he was down, they turned on him to betray him and send him like rats in a swear. Low-lived dogs, and they looked it. Page 33. The close association of coldness and whiteness is cemented further in Stephen's mind by another thought. Ellen had long white hands. One evening when playing ticks, he had put her hands over his eyes, long and white and then cold and soft. That was ivory, a cold white thing. Stephen's father calls the Irish a priest-ridden race, and Dante says about Parnell, a traitor to his country, a traitor and adulterer. The priests were right to abandon him. Towards the end of the scene, she says of Parnell, "Devil out of hell, we won. We crushed him to death, friend." Page 39. Mr. Casey cries with a sob of pain. Poor panel, my dead king, page 39. Stephen's father's eyes are also full of tears. Okay, in the poor section of the first chapter, Stephen is unjustly caned by Father Dolan. Stephen's glasses were broken and he was exempted from classwork by Father Armal. Father Dolan pays no heed to it and goes on to cane Stephen, also calling him a lazy, idle little loafer. The humiliation Stephen feels is great. He complains to the prefect of studies, who is sympathetic. The boys take it a victory of sorts. The sound of the cricket bats from the playground goes pick, pack, poke, poke, like drops of water in fountain falling softly in a brimming bowl. This beautiful simile closes the first chapter. Then section 1 of the second chapter is again set in Stephen's home at Blackrock. He is also sown in company of the Uncle Charles and accompanying his father and his granduncle as they took their constitutional. Trudging along the road or standing in some grimy wayside public house, his elders spoke constantly of the subjects nearer their hearts, of Irish politics, of Munster, on the legends of their own family, to all of which Stephen lent an avid ear. Reading the Count of Monte Cristo, Stephen muses on Mercedes. With a boy called Aubrey Mills, he founds a gang of adventures. The two also take rounds with the milkman. When Stephen's thoughts returned to Mercedes, a range unrest crept into his blood. He felt different from other boys even more than he did at Clongos. He wanted to meet in the real world of unsubstantial image which his soul so constantly beheld. If he managed to meet the image, weakness and timidity and inexperience would fall from him in that magic moment. Section 2 of the second chapter begins with the removal of Dublin, another instance of the family being always on the move. The sudden flight from the comfort and reverie of Blackrock, the passage through the gloomy, foggy city. The thought of the bare, cheerless house in which they were now to live made his heart heavy. Dublin for Stephen was a new and complex sensation. The vastness and strangeness of the life suggested to him by the bales of merchandise stalked along the walls or swung aloft out of the holes of steamers wakened again in him the unrest which had sent him wandering in the evening from garden to garden in search of Mercedes. Later the scene shifts from him to Stephen sitting in the midst of children's party at Harold's Cross. By now his silent, watchful manner had grown upon him. Later Stephen has a tram ride him with Emma. She came up to his step many times and went down to hers again between their phrases, and once or twice stood close beside him for some moments on the upper step, forgetting to go down, and then went down. His heart danced upon her movements like a cork upon a tide. Little later in the same section, there is a news of a place for Stephen at Belvedere College. Stephen's father talks to his wife about how Stephen's protest at Clongos was laughed at. The rector had told Stephen's father that he and Father Dolan had a hearty laugh over the protest. Section 3 of chapter 2 described life at Belvedere. There is to be a play and Stephen has a role in it. He looks forward to Emma being a part of the audience but feels let down when she does not come. A little before this, Stephen's declaring his preference for Byron over Tennyson brings from Heron a bullying reaction. Heron and another boy Blunt intimidate Stephen through physical violence and ask him to admit that Byron was no good. Stephen does not yield. Feeling let down by Emma, Stephen after the play rushes into the city. After the first flush of anger and frustration is over, things clear up a bit. He stood still and gazed up at the sombre porch of the March, and from that to the cobbled laneway at its side. He saw the word "Lords" on the wall of the lane and breathed slowly and sank heavy air. That is horse piss and rotted straw, he thought. It is a good order to breathe. It will calm my heart. My heart is quite calm now. I will go back. Page 91. In section 4 of chapter 2, Stephen visits Kirk with his father. There is a train ride and his father talks to Kirk and scenes of his youth. Stephen listens without sympathy. Later they are at the Victoria Hotel. His father sings a song and the consciousness of the warm sunny city outside his window and the tender tremors with which his father's voice festooned the strange, sad, happy air drove off all mist of the night's still ill humor from Stephen's brain. That is page 93 to 94. Father and son visit Queen's College. The sight of the word fetus caught several times in dark stained wood of a desk in the anatomy theatre has a powerful effect on Stephen. A vision of the life of the absent students of the college springs up before him out of the word caught in the desk. It shocked Stephen to find in the outer world a trace of what he had deemed till then a British and individual melody of his own mind. His father takes him round pubs that he frequented in his youth, but the overall effect of the visit is to somehow put a distance between father and son. There is also a stock-getting of sorts on Stephen's part when he thinks of his infancy, but the stock-getting only accentuated his apartness. An abyss of fortune or of temperament surrendered him from them. His mind seemed older than theirs. No life or youth stirred in him as it had stirred in them. In section 5 of chapter 2, Stephen wins a prize and prize money leads to short-lived euphoria. He treats his family, but soon the euphoria is over as his household returns to its usual way of life. His restlessness persists. He returned to his wanderings. The wild autumnal evenings led him from street to street as they had led him years before along the quiet avenues of Blackrock. Fires of lost wasted Stephen. His blood was in revolt. He wandered off and down the dark, slimy street, peering into the gloom of lanes and doorways, listening eagerly for any sound. He moaned to himself like some baffled, prowling beast. He wanted to sin with another of his kind, to force another being to sin with him and to exult with her in sin. It is in the state of mind that he finds himself confronted by a prostitute who detains him and gazes into his face. What weakens his resistance is that her room was warm and lightsome. Her round arms held him firmly to her, and seeing her face lifted to him in serious calm, and feeling the warm calm rise and fall of her breast, all but burst into hysterical weeping. Tears of joy and relief shone in his delighted eyes. When she asked him to give her a kiss, Stephen usual resistance to imperatives is there. In her arms he felt that he had suddenly become strong and fearless and sure of himself, but his lips would not bend to kiss her. When the resistance finally goes, he closed his eyes, surrendering himself to her body and mind, conscious of nothing in the world but the dark press of her softly patting lips. They pressed upon his brain as upon his lips, as though they were the vehicle of a vague speech, and between them he felt an unknown and timid pressure, darker than sheen of sheen, softer than sound or odor. The first two chapters complete the first major stage in Stephen's growth with his proper initiation into sexuality. The larger part of the following two chapters shows his feeling guilty on this score. There is the brief attraction that Stephen feels for priesthood as a vocation, but it is his rejection of this option that opens the way for his embracing his role as an artist. At the beginning of section 1 of chapter 3, Stephen is still not out of his nocturnal wanderings in the squalid quarter of Brothles. His life at school is listless. The retreat, the period of withdrawal from worldly activities and of spiritual recollection under discipline, is announced, to be followed by confession. The rector talks to him at some length. As he looks keenly at his listeners out of his dark, stern eyes, Stephen's heart withered up like a flower of the desert that feels the shimum coming from afar. Section 2 of chapter 3 contains the three sermons given on successive days. The introductory sermon stirs self-disgust in Stephen. This is the first day. On the second day, sermons on death and judgment bring the agony of shame. This is the temporarily relieved by a daydream of forgiveness, hand in hand with Emma. The third day is the most dramatic for Stephen. Sermons on hell overwhelm him completely. In section 3 of chapter 3, Stephen returns home in self-disgust and terror. He is physically sick too, he prays, and the result of this, his eyes were dimmed and with tears looking humbly up to heaven, he wept for the innocence he had lost. Then comes confession in a chapel. This is preceded by his walking in the streets in a daze. When the priest enters the box and two other penitents take their turn at confession, the effect on Stephen is striking. His blood began to murmur in his veins, murmuring like a sinful city summoned from its sleep to hear its doom. When Stephen's own turn for confession comes, his sins trickle from his lips one by one in shameful drops from his soul, festering and oozing like a squalid stream of vice. The last sin oozed forth sluggish, filthy. There was no more to tell. He bowed his head overcome. Page 156. Once Stephen is absolved, he finds relief and peace. He knelt to say his penance, praying in a corner of the dark lane, and his prayers ascend to heavens. From his purified heart like perfume streaming upwards from a heart of white rose. The muddy streets were gay. He strode homeward, conscious of an invisible grace pervading and making light his limbs. In spite of all he had done it. He had confessed and God had pardoned him. His soul was made fair and holy, once more bold and happy. At college he has the sense of another life of grace and virtue and happiness made possibly by his spiritual experience. In section 1 of the 4th chapter there is a change in Stephen's day-to-day life. He follows a rigorous discipline of prayer and self-mortification. He attends mass daily and carries rosary beads in his pocket. On successful days of the week he prays for the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit to counter the defilement of the 7 deadly sins. Her Joyce shows Stephen drifting further and further away from reality. The whole program of self-discipline amounts to subordinating the real to the ideal. In section 2 of the 4th chapter, the director of studies summons Stephen for an interview. The possibility of priesthood as a vocation is suggested to him. The director tells him that priesthood is the greatest honor that God can bestow and that its authority surpasses all earthly authority. The effect of the director's words on Stephen is a flame began to flutter again on Stephen's cheek as he heard in his proud address an echo of his own proud musings. How often had he seen himself as a priest wielding calmly and humbly the awful power of which angels and saints stood in reverence. That is page 171. The temptation exercised by priesthood is however temporary. As he is at the door taking leave of the director, 4 young men stride past, arms linked, singing to a concertina. The contrast between that sight and the mirthless mask of the priest's face stirs in Stephen an instinct of recoiling from the cold orderliness of Jesuit life. The threat to his freedom that such a vocation stands for decides him against it. Stephen realizes that in priesthood it was a grave and ordered and passionless life that awaited him, a life without material cares. He wondered how he would pass the first night in the novitiate and with what dismay he would make the first morning in the dormitory. He smelt again the warm moist air which hung in the bath in the Clongos above the sluggish turf-colored water. Some instincts waking at those memories stronger than education or pity quickened within him at a very near approach to that life. An instinct subtle and hostile and armed him against acquiescence. The chill and order of the life repelled him. What fortifies him further in his rejection of priesthood is the awareness that his destiny was to be elusive of social or religious orders. The wisdom of priest appeal did not touch him to the quick. He was destined to learn his own wisdom apart from others, or to learn from the wisdom of others, himself wandering among the snares of the world. The snares of the world were its ways in sin. He found fall. Not to fall was too hard. Back home, after crossing the bridge over the Tolka, he smiles to think that it was disorder, the misrule, the confusion of his father's house, and the stagnation or vegetable life which was to win the day in his soul. Then section 3 of the 4th chapter shows Stephen waiting for his father, who was making inquiries for him about place at the university. That possibility was a strong appeal for Stephen. Turning towards the sea to cross the bridge to the island called the Bull, he meets a group of Christian brothers coming from the opposite direction. Meanwhile, we are told that his mother was hostile to the idea of his going to the university. He sees it as her disloyalty, and something makes him aware dimly and without regret of a first noiseless sundering of their lives. The voices of the students bathing nearby are heard. The mock is named. He senses the destiny prophetically represented by Daedalus. Daedalus is a figure from Greek mythology, a craftsman who built the labyrinth of Crete. He also made wings for himself and his son Icarus. The university in Stephen's eyes amounted to his having passed beyond the challenge of the centuries who had stood as guardians of his boyhood. So the name is associated with transcendence of sorts. He takes from his treasure a quotation from Hugh Miller and speaks it softly and inaccurately to himself. A day of dappled sea-worn clouds. The actual clouds that he sees voicing across the deserts of the sky make him think of Europe. The Europe these clouds had come from lay out there beyond the Irish Sea, Europe of strange tongues and valleyed and woodle-girt and citadeled, and of entrenched and marshalled races. Later Stephen takes off shoes and stockings and gets down to the strand. He sees a girl wading in mid-stream, staring out to the sea. She has a striking girlish beauty, and she looks at him lingeringly. Her legs and thighs are bare. Heavenly God, cried Stephen's soul in an outburst of profane joy. This is followed a little later by her image had passed into his soul forever, and no word had broken the holy silence of his ecstasy. Her eyes had called him, and his soul had laughed at the call. The message is clear: to live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. The effect on Stephen's soul is quite remarkable. His soul was swooning into some new world, fantastic, dim, uncertain as undersea, traversed by clouds, safes, and being space 187. What had made Stephen receptive to this experience is mentioned a couple of pages prior to his climatic experience. He was alone. He was unhid, happy, and near to the wild heart of life. He was alone and young and willful and wild-hearted. Page 185. This experience is almost a resurrection for him. In section 1 of the 5th chapter, Stephen is first shown having breakfast at home. He is shown fiddling with tickets for the clothes that family had pawned under false names. As he walks to the university, his morning walk through Dublin carries literary association evoked by his surroundings. He reaches college late and finds the dean of studies trying to light the fire in the physics theatre. He reaches the colleague late and finds the dean of studies trying to light the fire in the physics theatre. The two talk for some time. Later there are conversations with McCann, Temple and Devin. Talk of the nationalist cause makes Stephen talk of Parnell's betrayal by the church. Stephen sees Father Moran, the instructor, flirting with Emma and this angers him. The unlikely audience that Stephen now finds for expounding his aesthetic theory is Lynch, who does not have much interest in things of this kind. At the end of this section, Emma is seen under the library arcade, brooding on her leads, Stephen now nowhere. In section 2 of chapter 5, we have from Stephen a poem to Emma that is an artificial product of literary and religious verbalism. In section 3, we find Stephen standing on the steps of library watching the birds crying and circling above. When Emma comes out of the library in response of Cranell's salutation, the bows to him and ignores Stephen. Stephen starts thinking about Cranell's possible interest in her. Yet the sight of Emma in the falling light makes Stephen stroll away from the group with a kind of inner peace. His reverie as he moves away is first literary, then erotic. A kind of severance from Emma is nevertheless met. He comes back to the group and takes Cranley away with him on a walk. Stephen and Cranley talk about Stephen's mother and his family situation. Stephen's decision to leave is of course final. When Cranley suggests to Stephen the impracticality of his notion of unfettered freedom, Stephen comes out with a clear-cut statement of his new faith. I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it call itself my home, my fatherland or my church, and I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile and cunning. Page 262-9. Cunning here refers to cultivating craftsmanship, and the other two terms, silence and exile, refer to his not being afraid of being isolated on his quest of the freedom he sees essential for the artist. Finally, in section 4 of chapter 5, the last of 19 sections that the novel is built around, we have scraps from Stephen's journal for the time prior to his actual departure from Dublin. Those who figure in these jottings are friends like Pranil and Devin, Emma and Stephen's mother. The decision to leave is of course irrevocable. It only gets reaffirmed in a variety of ways. This section shows Stephen poised for the flight. The overall portrait emerges from the novel as a whole of an extra sensitive, proud, isolated individual who nevertheless has in him what is supposed to go into the making of an artist rather the artist. His continuous search is for warmth, for experience, for its own sake, for transcendence of a kind, for getting away and for being on the move. Beauty of a certain kind is also something that he reaches out for. At the same time, he would rarely do things under coercion. That is the rebellious streak in him. Squalor bothers him, poverty bothers him, but certain kinds of orderliness bother him still more. He likes to be on his own and prefers learning things firsthand. He visualizes himself as a priest of the imagination and as some kind of wordsmith and maker. The diary fragments in the closing sections of the novel are seen by some as a kind of come down. Actually, they represent the artist's attempt to grapple with subjective reaction by setting them down. They show the beginning of the creation of an objective world from inner experience. These entries are a way of resisting a regressive decline into subjectivism. They refer to certain life facts that are yet to be elaborated and are left like that. These facts make a turning point in Joyce's life away from crisis towards the establishment of an identity independent of restrictive locales. As already noted, Hugh Kenner tells us that the pattern with which each chapter of the novel exhibits is one of the dream nourished in contempt of reality put into practice and dashed by reality. The movement of a portrait in the light of this could be seen as a sort of vicious spiral, since each chapter closes with a synthesis of triumph that in turn feeds the sausage machine set up in the next chapter. In each case, the synthesis of triumph can be seen as an approximation to the cry that Stephen finally utters at the end of the book, "Welcome, O life." Thus, the first chapter ends with his successful appeal against injustice, which leaves him feeling happy and free and hearing the sound of cricket bats like drops of water in a fountain falling softly in the brimming bowl. The second chapter ends with a new awakening and the image of life. The end of the third chapter reads another life, a life of grace and virtue and happiness. Near the end of the fourth chapter, Stephen exclaims, "To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life." Thus, when at the end of the book Stephen announces that he is going to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, it is already the fifth in an exhilarating sequence of new starts. Okay. So again friends, I will tell Stephen's aesthetic theory. So Stephen's aesthetic theory क्या है उस बारे में पढ़ेंगे. The three main principles of the theory of aesthetics put forward by Stephen are: art is a stasis brought about by the formal rhythm of beauty. Okay, so art is a stasis brought about by the formal rhythm of beauty. So art of beauty diverged from good and evil is akin to truth. Therefore, if truth can best be approached through intellection, beauty or art is best approached through the three stages of apprehension. Okay, then the three qualities of beauty which correspond to the three stages of apprehension are in terms of acuteness, integritas and consonantia and claritas. Okay, so here you remember the 3 points, and the 3 points are the basic key points. Okay, so the three main principles. So what are the three main principles of the theory of aesthetics according to Stephen's? Okay, so Stephen के नज़र में aesthetic theory क्या है, कला के मतलब क्या है, मीन्स कला एक ब्यूटी है एंड कला एक गुड एंड एविल फॉर्म ऑफ ट्रूथ है. ओके, सो एट ऑफ ब्यूटी डिवॉर्स फ्रॉम गुड एंड एविल इज अकिन टू ट्रूथ. ओके, कोई अच्छा होता है, कोई बुरा होता है, और अच्छे और बुरे का बैलेंस को एक ब्यूटी और कला के रूप में प्रकाश किया जाता है. The three qualities of beauty which correspond to the three stages of apprehension are in the terms of acuteness, integritas, integritas means wholeness, okay, consonantia means harmony, and claritas means radiance. Okay, so these are the characteristic or features of beauty according to Stephen's. Okay, so here is the main key point, you can note down. So art is a stasis brought about by formal rhythm of beauty. Art of beauty diverged from good and evil is akin to truth. The three qualities of beauty which correspond to the three stages of apprehension are in the terms of acuteness, integritas, consonantia and claritas. Okay, so you only remember the terms. Okay, then according to terms you describe all the points in your own words. Okay, the two main principles of this theory, art as stasis and the separation of beauty and evil, are based by Stephen on one sentence by Saint Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century saint, which he translates, that is beautiful the apprehension of which pleases. Okay, so Saint Thomas Aquinas एक सेंट थे, मतलब एक साधु संत व्यक्ति थे जो 13th सेंचुरी के थे, which he translates, that is beautiful the apprehension of which pleases. So beauty किसको को बोला जाता है, जो ब्यूटी जो किसको अट्रैक्ट करता है. ओके, दैट इज ब्यूटीफुल, द एप्रीहेंशन ऑफ विच प्लीजेस. प्लीजेस मीन्स किसको खुश भी करता है. द सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ द एसोसिएशन ऑफ ब्यूटी विथ ट्रूथ of the stages of apprehension with the qualities of beauty is that it helped Joyce or Stephen to suggest that pure art exists as a delicate balance between the art object and the one who perceives it. Okay, so you can see the significance of the association of beauty with truth. So what is the significance of association of beauty with truth according to Stephen? The question may arise. Okay, so you can write of the stages of apprehension with the qualities of beauty is that it helped Joyce or Stephen to suggest that pure art exists as a delicate balance between the art object and the one who perceives it. Okay, so you can write the delicate balance between the art object and the one who perceives it. What Joyce does here is to secularize the Thomist insistence on the moral obligations of the artist by demanding instead intellectual or psychological obligations. By Thomism is meant the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so what Joyce does here is to secularize the Thomist insistence on the moral obligations of the artist by demanding instead intellectual or psychological obligations. By Thomism is meant the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so you can write what Joyce does here is to secularize the Thomist insistence on the moral obligations of the artist by demanding instead intellectual or psychological obligations. By Thomism, okay, is meant to Thomas Aquinas. Where the three qualities of beauty are concerned, Stephen's interpretation of consonancia accords generally with the due proportion that Aquinas notes as the characteristic of beauty. So already I have told you that it's a characteristic feature of beauty which was told by Stephen. Here the important difference to be noted is between Aquinas' concept of form and rhythm as a manifestation of being and Joyce more mundane mechanistic interpretation. Okay, so here is the important difference to be noted. So what is the important difference which we can note down? So here the important difference to be noted is between Aquinas' concept of form and rhythm as a manifestation of being and Joyce's more mundane mechanistic interpretation. With Claritas, Stephen sharply diverges from the orthodox interpretations of Saint Thomas. Okay, so with Claritas, Stephen sharply diverges from the orthodox interpretations of Saint Thomas. So the theory of Thomas was discarded by Stephen. Okay, by which point? With Claritas. Okay, so 4 points we previously read of beauty according to Stephen. So the point is Claritas. So Claritas, Stephen sharply diverges from the orthodox interpretation of Saint Thomas. So here it is the point is Claritas. Okay, here is the point is Claritas. Okay, then when Stephen is talking of Claritas in a portrait, there is a substitution of Quidditas for Claritas. The purpose seems to be to avoid the spiritual connotation of the latter. Okay, so the purpose seems to be avoid the spiritual connotation of the latter. So in Claritas no spiritual connotation is there. Okay, but in Quidditas the spiritual connotation is there. So in this way Claritas is different from Quidditas. In Stephen's scheme of things, Quidditas means the whatness of a thing. As for integritas, Stephen translates it as wholeness, but what is nearer to his meaning is perfection. Okay, so what is Quidditas and what is Claritas and what is integritas? In Stephen's scheme of things, Quidditas means whatness of a thing. ये थिंग को क्या कहा जाता है, तो उसका मतलब है Quidditas. Okay, so only whatness. Okay, not the why, how. This thing cannot be explained by Quidditas. Okay, all of you remember what is Quidditas and what is Claritas. Claritas means clarity and Quidditas means questions. Okay, whatness of a thing. As for integritas, Stephen translates it as a wholeness, but what is nearer to his meaning is perfection. So integritas means wholeness, but the nearer meaning is perfection. How perfectly the thing is done. So that means it is integritas. Stephen consistently secularize Aquinas. He adheres to Thomist categories, but his interpretation of them is suited to his own purposes. One doctrine which he accepts completely is the identification of truth as the conformity of mind and object. Okay, one doctrine which he accepts completely is the identification of truth as the conformity of mind and object. He finds it especially useful because it provides him with a justification of absolute psychological standards for art. Okay, he finds it especially useful because it provides him with a justification of absolute psychological standards for art. So he finds it especially useful because it provides him with a justification of absoluteness psychological standards for art. It also offers him a defense against the charge that his theory is that of an art for art's sake votary. Okay, so it also offers him a defense against the charge that his theory is that of an art for art's sake votary. His major difference with Aquinas is that he sees the artwork as a world in itself with the appropriate standards of completeness, harmony and clarity, rather than as a fragment or a symbol of broader, more extensive unity. Aquinas was helpful to Joyce to the extent Joyce could use the scholastic method of logical argument against the vague generalities of the moralists or the dilettantes. Okay, so Aquinas was helpful to Joyce to the extent Joyce could use the scholastic method of logical argument. So Aquinas का मतलब क्या होता है? So Aquinas was helpful to Joyce to the extent Joyce could use the scholastic method of logical argument against the vague generalities of the moralities or the dilettantes. Okay, so Aquinas के मतलब क्या होता है ना? Aquinas was helpful to Joyce to the extent Joyce could the scholastic method of logical argument. So जो लॉजिक के मतलब लॉजिक के थ्रू जो आर्गुमेंट किया जाता है और जो वैलिड है तो उसको बोलते हैं एक्यूनेस अगेंस्ट द वेग जनरलिटीज ऑफ द मोरलिस्ट और द डिलेटेंट्स. सो जो कुछ वेग है और जो कुछ इन अ ब्रॉडर सेंस है तो उसको कैलकुलेट नहीं किया जाता है, इसको इंक्लूड नहीं किया जाता है, उसको बोलते हैं moralist or dilettantes. Another important aspect of Stephen's theory of art is his explanation of the three forms of art: the lyrical, the epical and the dramatic. Okay, again the Stephen's theory of art describes the lyrical, the epical and the dramatic. So here is the main key point you can note down: the Stephen's theory of art. Okay, Stephen's theory of art based on the lyrical, the epical and the dramatic. The lyrical, the epical and the dramatic. Okay, that is the Stephen's theory of art. So Aquinas does not come in here. This can best be read as simply a commentary on Stephen's and Joyce's artistic development, which is clearly a progression from the lyrical to the dramatic. In a sense, Stephen's aesthetic is made to grow and change as Stephen himself grows and changes. Some parts of the aesthetic, however, remain constant, which is clearly a progression from the lyrical to the dramatic. In a sense, Stephen's aesthetic is made to grow and change as Stephen himself grows and changes. Some parts of the aesthetic, however, remain constant. In essence, the theory offered by Stephen is that the beautiful is what can be pleasurable apprehended by the senses of the mind. Static reception of this pleasure precludes the moral element which, instead of offering satisfaction, stirs feelings of desire or loathing. Truth satisfies the intellect while beauty satisfies the imagination. Okay, so truth satisfies the intellect while beauty satisfies the imagination. The beautiful affects the mind in this respect, that the mind is seized by its wholeness, fascinated by its harmony and enchanted by its radiance. So the essence of theory offered by Stephen is that beautiful is what can be pleasurable, apprehended by the senses or the mind. So here it is the main key point you can note down. The essence of theory offered by Stephen says that beautiful is what can be pleasurable, apprehended by the sense of the mind. Okay, static reception of this pleasure precludes the moral element, which instead of offering satisfaction starts feelings of desire or loathing. Truth satisfies the intellect, while beauty satisfies the imagination. Okay, the beautiful affects the mind in this respect, and the mind is seized by its wholeness, fascinated by its harmony and enchanted by its radiance. Then Stephen and woman. Apart from this mother and Dante, the first person from the opposite sex who figures in Stephen's life is Ellen. Okay, apart from his mother and Dante, the first person from the opposite sex, okay, who figures in Stephen's life is Ellen. It is her white hands and golden hairs that first stir his boy's notion about girls. His relationship with Ellen is not shown as amounting to much in the ultimate analysis. Then there are the romantic dreams about Mercedes, a character from the novel The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Okay, so some notable, the relationship between Ellen is not as amounting to much in ultimate analysis. Then there are romantic dreams about Mercedes, a character from the novel The Count of Monte Cristo. Okay, so a character from the novel The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Okay, the more romantic dreams comes about. She is the beloved of the novel's hero Edmond Dantes. Okay, she is the beloved of the novel's hero Edmond Dantes. Stephen pictures himself grandly rejecting her because she had earlier slighted his love. The next person from the opposite sex to figure in Stephen's life is Emma. Okay, the next person from the opposite sex to figure in Stephen's life is Emma, whom he meets at the party at Harold's Cross. Okay, the first person was Ellen and the second person is the Emma. Okay, so the Emma whom he meets at the party at Harold's Cross. Withdrawing from the other children, he realizes his isolation. Emma glances repeatedly and invitingly in his direction. She gives rise to a feverish excitement in him. Together they take the last tram home. They stand on the steps of the tram. He is on a step above hers. As they talk, she keeps coming up to join him on his step. He knows that she is making an advance to him, and yet he is unable to respond in kind. The failure bothers him, but all that comes out of it an attempt to write a poem to Emma. 2 years later, there is a school play in which Stephen figures. He works himself up into an excited, romantic mood, anticipating a meeting with Emma after she has seen the play. 2 years later, there is a school play in which Stephen figures. He works himself up into an excited, romantic mood, anticipating a meeting with Emma after she has seen the play. The whole thing collapses, which he does not find Emma in the audience. The sexuality that might have found an outlet through his relationship is diverted elsewhere, culminating in his experience with the prostitute. The sexuality that might have found an outlet through his relationship is diverted elsewhere, culminating in his experience with the prostitute. Okay, so 2 years later, there is a school play in Stephen figures. He works himself up into an excited, romantic mood, anticipating a meeting with Emma after she was seen the play. The whole thing collapses when he does not find Emma in the audience. The sexuality that might have found an outlet through this relationship is diverted elsewhere, culminating in his experience with the prostitute. In this experience, he is able to find not only relief from the goadings of his lost, but a new self-assurance. Okay, so from this relationship, or experience, Stephen find relief from the goadings of his lust, but a new self-assurance. Okay, after a cycle of sin and guilt, the wedding girl becomes for him a way out of his dilemma. After a cycle of sin and guilt, okay, sin means पाप होता है और guilt means कुछ गलत करना होता है, गलत करने के बाद जो रिपेंटेंस होता है उसको बोलते हैं गिल्ट. Okay, after a cycle of sin and guilt, the wedding girl becomes for him a way out of his dilemma. She becomes the catalytic agent for creativity. Okay, then she becomes the catalytic agent for creativity. So according to Stephen, so she becomes the catalytic agent for creativity. So here she refers to whom? Emma. In the final chapter, Stephen imagines that Emma flirts with Father Moran. Okay, in the final chapter, Stephen imagines that Emma flirts with Father Moran, and yet the sight of her near the entrance of the library gives rise to the thought that she may be innocent. Okay, so library gives rise to the thought that she may be innocent. There is a surge of emotions, and again which does not come out of it. He does write a poem to her and pictures her in remorse. There is a surge of emotions, and but again much do not come out of it. He does write a poem of her to her, pictures her in remorse. When Emma ignores him outside the library, he thinks that she is consciously rebuffing him and that Cranley is pursuing her. When Emma ignores him outside the library, he thinks that she is consciously rebuffing him and that Cranley is pursuing her. The diary jottings at the end tell us that she has been wanting to make contact with him. She wants to know why she sees so little of him and whether he still writes poems. His reply is a rebuff aimed at embarrassing her, and yet he cannot fully get over the attraction he feels for her. It is another thing that the call for excelling himself, to which his soul responded, makes him push her to the back of his mind. Essentially, Stephen's inability to connect fully with girls of his age is tied up with his aloofness from most of his compatriots at school and university. Essentially, Stephen's inability to connect fully with girls of his age is tied up with his aloofness from most of his compatriots at school and university. It is partly timidity and partly a feeling of self-importance which prevents him from reaching out to people. His notions about what an artist should be like also contribute to his isolation. In general, his encounters with girls are awkward and unsatisfactory. In general, his encounters with girls are awkward and unsatisfactory. The fallout quite often is that he submits to crude sexual fantasies. Okay, then Stephen has not only a powerful imagination but an overpowering sensuality. When his sexual yearnings are frustrated, fantasizing takes over quite often. The vaguely idealized notion of a tryst represented by the sentimental fantasy over Mercedes is among the first projection of Stephen's sexuality. This sexuality gets physically transfigured into the idea of Emma. Stephen's enigmatic use of her initials for his poem, even in the poem she remains a vague, distant figure, helps to underline her elusiveness. So while one can grant something of a search for love in Stephen's agonized, agitated yearning, aggravated by the kiss that he wanted, not really materializing, it is lost, not love, which finally gets gratified in the scenes with the woman in the brothel. So brothel means prostitution's home. The woman is in many ways the end of his searching, promising release as well as rest. The encounter also promises a kind of knowledge and with that some amount of certainty. Regarding Emma's presence in the rest of the novel, there is a slight shift towards the end of the novel. There is Stephen's fear that he has misjudged her, that his mind breeds vermin, and that she is beyond the images he projects on her. Stephen's sharp recognition in the closing lines of the novel of how he had been distorting her is also a recognition, significantly, of patterns of delusion that have clouded his mind from the early parts of the novel. At the same time, we should not overlook the fear that bothers Stephen, that Emma would keep his soul at home in a sterile Ireland if he did not abruptly get away from her and from thinking of her. So, there is Stephen's fear that he has misjudged her, that his mind breeds vermin, that she is beyond the images of he projects on her. Stephen's sharp recognition in the choosing lines of the novel of how he had been distorting her is also a recognition, significantly, of patterns of delusion that have clouded his mind from the early parts of this novel. At the same time, we should not overlook the fear that bothers Stephen and Emma would keep his soul at home in a sterile land if he did not abruptly get away from her and from thinking of her. For the larger part of the novel, Stephen is unable to think of women except in fixed, polarized terms. Most of the time, Stephen is able to come to terms with women symbolically as a strong maternal figure. Even the prostitute in sense mothers him. His clumsy response to Emma towards the end of the novel is a function of monk-like withdrawal into the spiritual heroic refrigerating apparatus that he has. The preeminence of the virgin or mother model prevents Stephen from approaching women on more comprehensive and inclusive terms, through woman is represented in a portrait in a wide range of figures and images. We can conclude that, in general terms, woman as image can be seen as having two contradictory and almost mutually exclusive sets of meaning. At one level, woman is possessive and a kind of stumbling block where Stephen's progress toward freedom and creative art is concerned. His mother largely and Ellen, Mercedes and E.C. partly belong here. And the other level, woman is a source of freedom and enlightenment. The wedding girl before her, the prostitute, belong to this category. So then let's sum up. Stephen's growth into adulthood and his evolution as an artist are captured by Joyce quite competently, though the two thrusts are often at variance. Stephen's aesthetic theory is influenced substantially by St. Thomas Aquinas. His attitude to women is inadequate, partly an account of his general inability to relate to people in general, and partly an account of the virgin or mother fixation that he suffers from. Up to a point, the prostitute is the kind of his search because she offers him release, certainty and knowledge in a variety of ways. So here are the questions. What is the significance of the Christmas dinner scene in a portrait? Who are the main participants in the discussion? What effect does Stephen's experience with the prostitute have on him? What is the relationship between Dublin and Stephen, especially in the light of his wanderings in the city? Then here it is the suggested reading. As suggested earlier, Harry Levin's James Joyce, A Critical Introduction, offers a good starting point. You should also read William York Tyndall's A Reader's Guide to James Joyce. For a treatment of Stephen's aesthetic theory, a good place is William T.S. Noon's book Joyce and Aquinas. Some idea of Stephen's relationship with women and Joyce's general treatment of women can be had from Suzette Hank and Ellen Uncle's Ed's Women in Joyce. So, in this video, we already covered up the chapter 7 unit 3, Stephen's growth and personality, a portrait of the artist as a young man. Okay, so the portrait of the artist, so already we have covered up. Here it is the Stephen's growth and personality. Okay, here the Stephen's growth and personality already we have covered up. So thank you viewers. Please like, share and subscribe this channel and share with your friends to get good marks in your upcoming exam. So thank you viewers.